Welcome to Hashkafa with a Heretic, where we explore the works of Hashkafa that are often recommended to people with questions of Emunah to lay our doubts and keep us on the derech. I blog as the second son, and I'm your heretical host. Are there really answers to all the questions? Are kashis really terutzim? Are we stark apikorsim or stam amaratzim? Let's find out. This is episode 3, Chovos HaLevavos, part 3. In this week's episode, we discuss the first 3 chapters of the Chovos HaLevavos, and we cover whether the questions and the issues that Chovos HaLevavos discusses are more relevant today or 1,000 years ago when it was written, what Shema means, one God versus our God, whether you can will yourself to believe something, people who think they're firmer than God, and how those who recommend the Chovos HaLevavos to those of us who have questions don't actually follow its advice. My guest this week is Micheal Jacobson. Someone I've interacted with online in different forums, and he's going to join us to discuss the first gate of Chovos HaLevavos. So I noticed the translator had an introduction here to the first part here, and he says that he's heard a lecture that in the time of the Rambam, people really seeking and bringing intellectual proofs was beneficial. But today, the biggest question on people's minds is whether to put ketchup or mustard on their hot dogs. That's cute, right? It's cute, but I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true either of the past or of today. I think most people don't really give this stuff much thought. And in the time of the Rambam, even less. Most people couldn't even read. Or a few people, like the Rambam himself, right? He was a theologian and a philosopher and a doctor. He was one of the educated elites. The average person they didn't have hot dogs, but whatever the equivalent was, they were still worried about that. And if anything, today more people think about this stuff because they can read and books are cheap, relatively speaking.
And of course, the ubiquity now of the Internet and the fact that knowledge is at everyone's fingertips. In fact, my experience, I've seen that amongst my children's friends, and my children are in their 20s, there's a lot more of them that have thought about these issues than there seemed to have been when I grew up in the modern Orthodox world 30, 40 years ago. So I'm not so sure that in the time of the Rambam, where there was so many more concerns for the average person just in terms of having the necessities for life, that they would have had the time or, like you said, the ability to find these questions out and think about them.
For myself also, the Internet. Well, I discovered the Jewish Skeptic blogs back in 2008, I think, 2008, 2009, and that was sort of a turning point. They didn't really introduce me to anything new, but it was like all these things I'd been thinking for so long, and here were other people who were thinking the same things, and they weren't crazy. Maybe I'm not crazy either.
Exactly. It was a big comfort. I had the same experience in the early 2000s.
1,000 years ago when Chovos HaLevavos was written, when the Rambam was writing, you could get hung for stuff like this. People were burned at the stake for heresy.
Right.
So, if anything, it probably is more relevant today.
Right. In addition to which, I think in the time of the Rambam, because of the state of science at the time, these questions were less relevant in some cases because absent any better explanations for a lot of the natural events that we see in the world, it would have been more reasonable anyway to maintain the beliefs in God, whereas today, with science being able to explain so many things that were inexplicable then, I would think that it's much more difficult to just maintain the divine belief in the face of what I believe, of course, are better competing answers.
I was just reading something where the author was saying that in ancient Greece, there were some philosophers that hit upon naturalism, and it started to be a movement, and then it sort of petered out because they had nothing really concrete to replace the gods with. So they they thought the gods probably aren't real, there's probably something else going on, but they didn't know what, and people said, well, that's just dumb.
Darwin was a big turning point.
Yeah, let's start here with the introduction. I'm just going to read it, and I'll stop if I have a thought. You stop me if you have a thought. After investigating after what is the most necessary of the cornerstones and fundamentals of our religion, we found that the wholehearted acceptance of the unity of God is the root and foundation of Judaism. It is the first of the gates of the Torah, and it differentiates between the believer and the heretic. It is the head and the front of religious truth, and one who strays from it will not be able to perform religious deeds, and his faith will not endure. So right here, this is interesting. This is how I'll say that they still hold of the unity of Hashem. It's as if he has all these different parts, but when you read through it, awful lot like polytheism. There's the Ein Sof, which is God himself, and then there's all the bits of him. A lot of polytheism works that way. There's one great God, and then there are aspects of him.
Right.
Because of this, God's first words to us on Mount Sinai were, I am the Lord your God. You shall not have other gods before me. And later on, he exhorted us through his prophet, saying, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So this, I think, is an anachronistic interpretation of Shema and of the verse of the Sesedivis, because really what Hashem says is, I'm your God, and don't worship any other ones. He doesn't say, I'm the only God. He doesn't say, that the other gods are false, or that, he certainly doesn't say, I am one. He says, I'm the only one for you.
Exactly. I was going to point out the exact same thing, that I am the Lord your God. If the author of the Torah, let's assume, for argument's sake, that it was God talking, if he were the only God that there was, it's not even like there are other gods that are fake. Those are just imagination by people. There is only one God, it's me. I am the creator of the universe. That would have been what he said. I am the creator of the universe. But to say I am the Lord your God is what someone would say if they were polytheistic and they did believe in multiple gods, but they believed in gods for people and gods for places, which was a common belief in the ancient Near East. And so here he's just saying, I am your God. So there may be other gods, but I'm yours, and therefore don't have other gods before me.
And that's a good point, that he didn't say, I am God who created the universe. He said, I'm your God who took you out of Egypt. In other words, look at this great thing I just did for you. Now you owe me, and you worship me and nobody else, because I'm a jealous God.
It's like gods would adopt people and peoples. And in this case, this God is saying, I basically adopted you as my peoples, and I took you out of Egypt, and so I am your God.
You should study this chapter of Shema until its close, and you will see how its words move from one matter to another, accomplishing 10 matters. That number corresponds to the 10 commandments. Okay, magic numbers. Also, there aren't actually 10 commandments, but that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
The explanation is as follows. First, there is the command to believe in the Creator when it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord. Well, again, that's not what it says. It doesn't say, believe in me. It assumes that you already believe in him, right? We tend to translate Shema as, Hear, O Israel, God is your God, God is one. But really, what it's saying is, Yahweh is your God, and he's the only God for you.
In addition to which, the concept of being commanded to believe is preposterous.
Yes, that's a very good point. You can't force yourself to believe something. Either you think it's true or it's not true, or some probability of being true.
You don't have the ability to cause your brain to fire in such a way as that when it analyzes the different possibilities, it will select one. That isn't how it works. Your brain tells you, based on the evidence that it accumulates and analyzes, what you believe. So you can pretend like you believe in something, but you certainly can't be commanded to believe in something. The example I give is, if suppose your father walks up to you and says, oh, hi, and you say, oh, hi, Dad, and you see who it is, and of course you know it's your father. So you know, that's knowledge. But if there's a knock at the door and the person doesn't answer when you say who it is, and your son tells you, oh, that's probably your father at the door. So you're then going to analyze whether that's reasonable for that to make sense. Well, is this a time he would be visiting? Would he have called first? Does he live in the same town? If your brain processes all that information and says, no, it can't be my father because my father is in another city, and there is no way he would simply have shown up here without calling me first, so you don't believe it's your father. So now at that point, if somebody came up and put a gun to your head and said, I command that you believe that is your father at the door, you can tell the guy with the gun, yeah, I do believe it's my father, but in reality, if you don't believe it's your father, you just don't believe.
And given that God is omnipotent, you can't pretend.
Exactly. Pretending is pointless.
His intent was not for hearing of the ear, but rather for belief and acceptance of the heart, which, as we just said, you can't do that. As the verse says, we will do and we will hear. And hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it. Yeah, that was a dumb thing to say.
Yeah.
And similarly, for all other verses which come in this way, using a term denoting hearing, the intent is only to bring to belief and acceptance.
That's interesting, though. It turns Nasa and Vanishma into, it's not tell us what to do and we'll do it and then you'll explain it to us, which is the way it's usually explained. In this case, Nishma means believe. We'll do it and then we'll believe. There might actually be something to that. If you do something that you don't believe in, cognitive dissonance can force you into deciding that you do believe it so that what you're doing isn't ridiculous.
Right. That certainly doesn't work in favor of whether that something is true. It's just there is a methodology by which you might come to accept something to be true, and that is if you just constantly repeat it or follow through on whatever it is that it's preaching for you to do.
Afterwards, he commanded us to believe that he alone is truly one, saying God is one.
To me, it's such an odd thing. If there were a singular God, and that God would obviously be aware that there are no other gods, why would it be so important for the God to command us to believe that he is only one? That really is imparting to God this, I don't know whether it's narcissism or whether it's insecurity, but why would a God command that you know that he is one?
So there's the firm answer, and then there's the answer I like. The answer I like is that he's a kid. He made this universe, and he wants to show it off, and he gets mad when he gives the credit to his brother.
Thereby you're giving him emotions, though.
Yeah, sure.
Which is a problem.
Well, I mean, the God of Tanakh has emotion. He gets mad, and he gets sated, and he has arms and hands and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, the Rambam decided that's not curses, but it says what it says.
Right. I've still never been able to understand or accept any of the apologetics, which is all they can be. If God is a perfect being that lacks for nothing, and how can there be any emotion of jealousy or a need for adulation or for recognition of who he is? That is a need. And perfect beings can't have any need.
So, of course, the apologetic is that it's all metaphor. He doesn't actually need anything. It's for our benefit. And the idolatry thing is the same thing, that for some reason, idolatry is bad for humans, so God's saying, don't do that. I don't really see that it was bad for humans per se, but, you know, that's the firm answer.
Right. But, you know, if that were so, it would seem to me that then the wording would have been much different. And why would God not have said that it's bad for you? For your sake, you need to believe in me. Not, I command you to believe in me. Because this sounds an awful lot like someone or some being that is, in fact, commanding you to accept him, not for your benefit, but because I demand it.
This is the problem with a lot of the apologetic answers, is that they make sense on their own terms, but then you have to ask, well, then why didn't he just say so, and why does it sound like this other thing?
Neither of the answers can be directly proven, let's say. These are both just claims. But at some point you have to evaluate which makes more sense, which fits closer to the word.
I think that what he's saying here is that he's assuming that it's obviously true that there is a God and everything else that follows. And therefore, if you study it, you'll inevitably come to that belief. So when we're commanded to believe in God, what we're really commanded to do is to investigate and to study, and then we'll believe in God. So it could be that he acknowledged that you can't force yourself to believe something, and this is a method by which you're going to make yourself believe in God.
Yes, but what's odd about that is that if this was true, and this is such an essential foundation of Judaism and of the truth of religion, then why is it that people today are not focused on this as the first thing that they should encounter when studying, before you study Gemara, before you study Torah, before you study anything? They should get into the philosophical discussion of why we believe in God and proof that this is the rational thing to believe in. In fact, instead, it's something that is avoided for the most part. Some of the book's authors even say that this shouldn't be read by everyone, this is not appropriate for everyone, so it's kind of contradiction.
Right. A lot of Kiruv books start that way. Really, if you have no questions, don't read this. But if Nebuch, you have questions, this may strengthen your emunah. And wasn't there, I forget which one, there was one of the books that actually put the section on evolution in the back, so that you would only read it if you really, really need it.
Was that Rabbi Slifkin's book?
No. This was one of the really Kiruv-y, might have been Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. I don't know, it's been a very long time since I read it. But it was that general idea that, you know, really you shouldn't be thinking about this stuff because you might come to the wrong conclusions.
Right.
And that in itself is kind of perverse. The idea that, you know, there are right conclusions and wrong conclusions. I mean, you might be mistaken, but you should go wherever the evidence leads.
To me, it just speaks to the fear of their lack of confidence in there actually being anything that rational thought is going to improve your chances of belief as opposed to lowering it. And if they were confident that it would improve your chances, then just as the author here is saying, how we are commanded to attempt to understand it from a rational perspective and to investigate it so that we can believe fully. The fact that that's not followed today, to me, is just a sign of lack of confidence that it will lead to the answer they want.
Because it often doesn't. There's a good reason that during the Hashkafa, something like 90% of Jews stopped being from, or well, not from, but stopped being what was then traditional observant Judaism. Afterwards, he moved on to exhort on the duties of the heart, as in saying, and these words which I command you this day shall be on your heart, which means to cleave to them to your heart and believe them in your inner being. Afterwards, he proceeds to the commandments of the limbs, which require both thought and action. As you said, you shall teach them to your sons. And so that if you don't have a son, you'll not mistakenly think that the commandment of verbally reading depends on having a son. He said, you shall speak in them. He does this a lot, where he tries to make a point and then he quotes Psukim over and over and over. This was a way of proving a point. This is pure medieval rationalism. You don't look at the world, you look in authoritative text.
Yes, a completely different epistemology.
Afterwards, he proceeded to the duties of the limbs, which consist of action only, and gave 3 examples, as you said. You shall bind them for a sign on your hand, and they shall be as tefillot between your eyes. And you shall write them upon the doorposts of your house and on your gates, which refers to the tefillin of the hand and the head and the mezuzah, all of whom cause one to remember the Creator and to wholeheartedly love Him and yearn to Him. And as Scripture says regarding how lovers keep their love in mind.
I'm wondering, he keeps referring to the heart as the center of thought. Was this before the time when a man realized that the brain was in charge of thought function?
Yeah, I can't quote dates off the top of my head, but I think that they didn't really know what the brain did. They knew that it was important because if you got hit in the head, things stopped working. The Gemara, I think, says the cognition comes from the kidneys.
Right, yes.
Because, I mean, to be fair, right, if you cut open a body and you look at it, there's no reason you would say the squishy gray stuff in the head is where the thought happens.
Right, but I don't know, why would you think that it comes from the heart? What sign do you have of that?
Maybe it's something like when you're feeling strong emotions, you get a feeling in your chest, which I think is where the idea that emotions are in the heart comes from. Maybe they connected it with that. I don't really know.
It would make sense, but I mean, the fact that he's just quoting this as though the thought comes from the heart because that's what the words say, again, that's problematic if we now know that the word, defining those words as referring to thought from the heart, that's clearly incorrect. Now that I'm looking at this, which is even, it's just a side point, but when he's talking about the duties of the limbs, and that includes tefillin and et cetera. But my contention, and I'm not the first one obviously who said this, is that totafot means remembrance. It doesn't mean a physical object, and it pretty much looks like this whole paragraph of the Shema is just written in metaphorical terms.
It does seem to be more poetry than anything else, but you're ruining one of the great Kiruv proofs, which is that even the Karaites have to look at the Torah Shabbat Peh to know what the Totafot means.
Right. Of course, if you decide, as the Torah Shabbat Peh did, that Totafot means a physical object like tefillin, then of course you would need to have further edification as to what the tefillin are, but that's only a proof of Torah Shabbat Peh if you accept that the Torah Shabbat Peh is correct in that Totafot means a physical object. But what's interesting is that one of the psukim he quotes here, I have engraved you upon the palms of my hands, from Yeshaya, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, does anyone think that that was literal?
Right. Well, there's no literal interpretation of that.
Right. And what about you have to inscribe these words on your heart? Does anyone say that every Jew must have open heart surgery and get a tattoo on their heart of the words? Of course not. So why would it make sense that in the same paragraph of a poem, there's this hopping back and forth between the clearly allegorical or metaphorical and the literal?
I was going to speculate. I think I'm almost convinced that something like tefillin, that comes first. And then you go back into Tanakh and you look for a hook to hang it on. And I think this is true of a lot of practices. That the practices arise for other reasons, for practical reasons, or because it was popular, or somebody had a nice idea. or because it was just something in culture, which we know that these kind of amulets that you strap to your body were something that existed in other cultures in that time and place.
It would make sense, right, that they adopted it and then found a way to justify it as having originated in the Torah.
I wouldn't use the word justify because I think they really did believe that this is where it comes from, right? They would say, well, we know we do this. I mean, the Gemara does this all the time, right? How do we know such and such? We already know it. We know that this is something that religious Jews do. We know that the right way to do it. Where do we see in the Torah that this is what you need to do? Oh, well, here it says such and such.
I hear your approach. I think that's true in some cases, but there are plenty of instances where I think they're not being totally honest, and they're not seeking to look for on what to rely when explaining something that there was already, a practice that was already being done. I think in some cases they were imposing new rules or changing definitions, but knew that it was going to be difficult to do unless they could find a way to justify it. And one example in terms of, I think, where they had to just try to find a justification for something that wasn't in practice but they knew should be, is the eye for an eye. I think that at the time of the Gemara already, the surrounding culture was not to impose what would have been considered barbaric. And so then they had to redefine something which I think would have been understood differently had surrounding culture continued to maintain that practice.
And then they read the new interpretation back into history, as in this was always the right way to understand it, and then it never changed.
Right.
Even though the law codes, like the Code of Hammurabi and other law codes from the surrounding culture, had the exact same law.
Correct.
Also, about the karais and tefillin, when I was a teenager in high school and I started to ask questions that made my rebbeim uncomfortable, I have to give them credit. They actually got me in touch with a Kiruv guy, and I went and I met with him for one afternoon a week for like a couple of months. And this was one of the things that he told me, that the Torah Shabbat has to be true because there are all these things that we can't know without it. And even the karais, they don't go by Torah Shabbat, they have to use Torah Shabbat that we have to know what tefillin are. And I wish I could go back and tell 16-year-old me that the karais don't wear tefillin.
Right. Exactly.
The definition of the wholehearted acceptance of the unity of God is that the heart and the tongue are equal in acknowledging the unity of God after understanding, in the way of logical proofs, the certainty of his existence and the truth of his unity. For acknowledgement of the unity of God among men differs according to their level of intelligence and understanding. So this is what I thought he was saying before, that if you study the logical proofs, then you will inevitably come to believe, and you're not just going to be saying it, you'll actually believe it. I'm not sure what he means about the acknowledgement of the unity of God.
I think to separate from all forms of polytheism and to try to give rational proofs why not only is there a God and that you must serve, but there can only be one and he must be whole and complete.
Yeah, that makes sense. That not only is there a God, but there's one God and our God.
And he is whole and complete and right, and doesn't have any parts, lest anyone try to sneak polytheism into a belief in one God, such as Christianity. One can argue whether it's polytheistic or not, but yeah, I think that that's the point here.
Among them, one who declares the unity of God with only his tongue, namely, that he hears people say something and he is drawn after them without understanding the meaning of what he was saying, so someone who's just parroting what he's heard. One who declares the unity of God with his heart and tongue, who understands the matter of what he is saying through the tradition that he received from his ancestors, but does not understand the clarification of what he received in this matter and the truth of what he believes in this matter. So this is referencing something that he talked about in the introduction, which is those people who really do believe in God and believe in Yiddishkeit, but they don't understand why. They grew up in it, it's what they do, and it's just, they believe that there's a God the same way they believe that there are trees, and because it's just part of their world, but they can't prove it, they don't really understand anything about it. Which, again, goes back to what you were saying before about how theology and Hashkafa it's de-emphasized in the frum world out of fear that people will come to the wrong answers.
Right, it's so much easier to keep someone in the fold as long as they're happy and they're going along with the program. Why would you even want to rock the boat and have them start thinking about whether any of this is true?
So the great thing about this, I think, is that he's saying that this is the wrong way to do things. It's not good enough.
Yeah, and right, because he's describing these people in order of how well they're accomplishing this based on their intelligence, and so he's working his way up the ladder to from people who believe for almost no reason at all to, as we'll see, people who have much thorough and clearer understanding.
One who declares his unity after understanding through logical proofs the truth of the matter, but he will conceive God's unity like other unities to be found, and he will come to form a material conception of the Creator, and represent him with a form and likeness, because he does not understand the true nature of his unity and the matter of his existence. And finally, one who declares God's unity with his heart and with his tongue after understanding the concept of true unity versus relative unity. He can bring proofs to demonstrate God's unity, God's existence, and true unity. This class of men is the complete, unblemished group regarding the matter of the unity of God.
Yeah, I think in the one prior, he was sort of denigrating the concept of anthropomorphism, where you provide God with a form and a likeness as a means to understand him, whereas the ultimate would be when you don't need that.
Which is interesting, because Tanakh does that all over the place. And even if you argue that that's only a metaphor, still it uses the metaphor as a means to conceptualizing God.
Exactly. Right. So God himself is anthropomorphizing himself by giving himself the Yad Chazaka and all of these things. If this is a negative, why would God even introduce the concept whatsoever?
This is part of a common and ongoing thing where you find people who are firmer than God.
Right. God didn't know as well as they do. They know better.
It reminds me of a post I wrote years ago about a wedding invitation I got, which had for both of the grandparents I think on both sides, whatever it was, it had the grandfathers' names and Reyasa, because apparently it's not sneeze to mention women's names. Never mind that Tanakh is full of women's names, and God wrote Tanakh, right? At least according to the people who sent out the invitation, they believe that God wrote Tanakh, but they know better, and they have to be firmer than God.
Of course. It's almost as though the Torah is not really what's guiding their actions, rather just some form of conservatism that they then ascribe to the Torah is where they get their rulings from.
And they consider the matter of unity is done for them when they finish reciting its words. And they do not sense that their heart is devoid of his truth and that their mind is empty of its meaning, because they declare his unity with their tongue and in words. They will conceive him in their hearts to be more than one, with forms of plurality, as will be explained, and represent him in their minds with the likeness of other unities to be found, and they will speak of his attributes in a way that cannot belong to the true unity, anthropomorphizing him, right, because they don't understand the matter of true unity versus temporary unity, except for a treasured few who plumbed the depths of wisdom and understood the matter of the Creator versus the created, the characteristics of true unity and what God is singular in. So I think he's trying to say that God is a different kind of thing than anything else that we encounter, and until you grasp that, you haven't quite gotten there and truly understanding what God is.
I'm still not clear what he means when he talks about temporary unity.
They
don't understand the matter of true unity versus temporary unity. I don't know what that means.
I think that this is a philosophical concept that I'm just not familiar enough with. It sort of rings a bell, but I'm not quite sure offhand.
I mean, unless, again, this is just to be a differentiator with Christianity and to imply that temporary unity would be, well, yes, we believe God is one, but God is also three, whereas a permanent, pure unity would be Judaism's view, where there is simply just one God and that's it. That's the only thing I can grasp from.
That could be, but I don't think he would have been writing this primarily as a polemic against Christianity, because it was written in Arabic. He lived in the Muslim world, where there wasn't the Trinity to deal with. But I mean, it could be.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what other way to explain temporary unity.
The philosopher spoke truth when he said, "No one can serve the cause of causes and beginning of beginnings, except the prophet of the generation with his senses, or the primary philosopher with the wisdom he acquired. But others serve other than him, since they cannot conceive what exists without beginning, but rather they can only conceive that which is composite." God is often described as being beyond our conception, and therefore we're not just that we're not qualified to say anything about him, but we're not entitled to say anything about him, because we can't possibly understand anything about him.
Which goes against the fact that earlier on he's saying that we must, that the commandment to believe really means we must investigate in order to come to the point where it becomes obvious that this is the correct belief.
It might be that he thinks he can prove that there is a God who created the universe and gave the Torah and et cetera, but you can't actually say anything about him.
Right, you can't think too much about him. You could think just enough about him so that my proof will work, and then stop before you get into trouble.
Well, if you keep going, then you realize that if you really can't conceptualize God at all, and you can't know anything about him, you also can't know whether or not he exists.
Right. It defeats the whole argument that they're going to present.
I mean, he was also starting with the assumption that God exists. I don't think that was ever a real question. His question was, how do we know?
Yeah, how can we prove it rationally?
Right. So the fact that this sort of undercuts it isn't really an issue. He's looking for supports, not for a foundation.
I'll buy that.
Because of this, the acceptance of the unity falls into 4 divisions, corresponding to different levels of recognition and understanding in men. 1. The unity of God in the tongue only. This level is reached by the child and the simpleton, who does not understand the manner of true religion and whose heart's truth is not fixed. I'm not sure that's true, though, because he said that in tongue only means that you say it, but you don't really believe it. And I think that children believe whatever they're told, because they have no other way.
Yeah, I don't think he's referring to they don't believe it. I think he's saying they don't understand it enough to have true belief, so they just, in essence, they're just, yeah, I believe in God. Like, they'll say the words, but they have no basis on which to explain why they believe in God.
Just thinking before, when he went through the levels of belief, and he said the people who say it, and the other people who say it and believe it because of tradition, and the other people who really believe it in their heart, unless this doesn't parallel that so nicely.
Well, I think the second one will. The first one is just like the lowest level is just the child by rote, basically. He's taught there is a God. Okay, I'm supposed to believe in God, so I believe in God.
2. Unity of God in the mind and in the tongue through tradition, because he believes those who he receives from, but he does not understand the truth of the matter through his own intellect and understanding. So here we come to the next, right? This is something that the Frum world also promotes. What he considers an insufficient level of understanding.
Amuna Pshuta.
I think Amuna Pshuta is the first one, where you just sort of accept it without understanding. This is Rav so-and-so is much smarter than you are, and he believed it, so why can't you just rely on him?
Or even before that, that's why I believe it's true. You're putting it as if they're trying to explain to someone else, but this is someone who's being described as someone, who doesn't really think about it. He simply believes because this is what we believe. This is what my Rebbe taught me, and this is what his Rebbe taught him. That's it.
I think that is what he's saying. What I mean is that people who ask uncomfortable questions are often told to stop, because do you think you're smarter than, are you smarter than the Rambam? Are you smarter than Rav Akiva Eiger? No, of course. They were smarter than you, and surely they thought of these questions, and it didn't bother them. So
right, an argument I've
you can rely on them. So that's what he's saying. You believe those who receive from.
Yeah, that's an argument that I've had presented to me at least 1,000 times.
And he's saying that that's insufficient. Here, the next line is, he's like the blind man who follows the seeing man, and it is possible that the one he follows receives the tradition from a receiver like himself, whereby it would be like a procession of blind men, where each one places his hands on the shoulders of the fellow behind him, until at the head is a seeing man who guides them all. The seeing man fails them or neglects them and is not careful to guard them, or if one of the blind men in the chain stumbles or some other trouble happens, all of them will share the same fate and will stray from the path. And it's possible they will fall in a pit or a ditch, or they'll stumble in something which blocks their progress.
But that's a different argument than the example you presented. Because the question you gave that people will often say in arguments against non-believers is, do you think you're smarter than? He's talking about a case of blind leading the blind, where, as his example. So therefore, the person he's talking about in this example is not necessarily relying on his ancestors and his teachers because he thinks they're so brilliant that I shouldn't even bother trying to think. It's just he's explaining that the reason why he believes is just because. I'm being led by so-and-so. It's just the tradition.
No, I think you're right. He's like the blind person who's just following the person in front of him, who is his father. And his father is another blind person following his father, and so on and so on and so on, all the way down the line. But it's possible that first person was wrong.
Correct.
So here's the thing. I have read essays by, I forget, it was one of the Rosh Yeshiva of YU. It was a beautifully written essay in which he basically said that he believes because father believed and his Rebbeim believed. And this was someone who people would definitely point at and say, he must have thought of the questions and didn't bother him. The point being that the people that we hold up as Gedolim they're Talmudists. And some of them are brilliant, but most of them are just not interested in this stuff. Or another example, when Rav Slifkin's books were banned, he got in touch with one of the Rabbanim who signed the ban and asked him, have you ever read my book? And he said no. He said no, but my, Rav so-and-so, who I highly respect, signed it, so I signed it too.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
That's this.
It's interesting that someone is not embarrassed to say that. Like you said, that the Rosh Yeshiva of YU, one of the Rosh Yeshiva said, I would be so embarrassed if somebody asked me why I believed in anything, and my answer was, well, because so-and-so said it, and so-and-so said it, and they're very smart, and so that's it, so I believe.
I would make a few caveats to that. One is that it matters how consequential it is. If it's something, if you tell me you have an aunt who lives in China, I'll believe you, because what do I care?
Right. If your father told you something that had no huge significance, you might say, okay, fine, I believe him because he told me.
The other thing is bigger, which is we do, to a great extent, we do trust the expert, because there's way too much to know for any of us to actually go and investigate each thing ourselves. But we, in general, we trust them because they are experts, because when you go to a doctor and you trust him because he spent 10 years in med school and as a resident and has been working and he presumably knows what he's doing. Whereas when you're trusting the great Rav who's so smart and who must have thought of these questions, he's trusting the great Rav of the generation before him, who trusted the great Rav of the generation before him, and it's the blind leading the blind until you finally get back to hopefully somebody who knew something.
Right. In your example, it's one thing to trust experts who have demonstrated their expertise. For instance, I don't know how a jet engine works. So if I read an article written by someone who says, well, it works like this, I'm not going to go into the details, but trust me, I will trust him. And the reason I will trust him is because I know that if I were to sit down with him and I would ask him to explain it to me, of course he could explain every bit of it. And obviously he must have in order to have achieved this position. But to trust someone who can't give you those answers and who basically is admitting, I don't have these answers, but since someone told me, you'll just have to take my word for it now. No, why should I take anyone's word who can't directly explain it to me?
Exactly.
Especially when the person you're quoting has not necessarily even demonstrated that he himself had any expertise in the area. Like,
right.
I don't know that the current Gadol Hador's Rebbe had, I assume he did not have any answers to any of these questions, because if those answers existed, then they would have been publicized and written, and there would be no problem.
And the answers that have been publicized and written are lousy. Like, probably getting ahead of myself here with that. There's that essay from Rav Chanan Wasserman where he basically says that, of course, it's obvious that God created the universe, and only an idiot wouldn't see that, because where else could it possibly have come from?
Yeah, nothing like using your own conclusion as to support your argument.
He was one of the Gedolei Hadar, and this is his argument. And people will definitely use his name as someone who, he must have thought of it, and he still believes, so you should too. Similarly, for one who proclaims unity out of tradition, one cannot be sure he will not come to association, that if he hears the words of the Meshanim and their claims, it is possible that he will change his outlook and will err without noticing. Because of this, our sages said, be eager to study the Torah and know its response and not be chorus, which, again, is something that nobody does.
Not only does nobody do it, but I'm sure you've heard this also, that they've reinterpreted this pasuk, where it says, Da ma shetashiv la'apikaris, and I would think the plain meaning of the words would say, you should have an understanding of how to respond to an apikaris by explaining to him rational proofs for God and disproving the apikaris' contention. But I've heard that to be reinterpreted, that it really means that at times you should know how to respond to an apikaris, meaning that it's pointless to even engage with them, and therefore you don't have to debate an Apikoros because the pasuk says you should know what to respond to them, and what that means is know that nothing's going to work.
Again, that makes a certain amount of sense. Right? You can definitely read it that way, but that's not the first thought you would have when reading it without any preconceptions. The third group, unity of God with the mind and the tongue after one can bring logical proofs demonstrating the truth of his existence, but without understanding the matter of true unity versus temporary unity. This is like a seeing man who is traveling along the road, wishing to reach a faraway land. Even though he knows the general direction, but the road splits to many uncertain roads, and he does not recognize the correct road which leads to the city he wishes to reach. He will greatly tire himself and will fail to reach his destination, because he does not know the correct road. As the verse says, the toil of the fool will tire him who knows not to reach a city.
So it's a guy who basically knows the logical proofs, but he doesn't understand the matter of true unity versus temporary unity. Again, I'm still not sure what he's referring to, but I'm assuming as we see Group 4, we'll get maybe a better understanding of what he means.
There's an authority here that the translator included, where he says that he knows that there's a God, but he does not know the difference between the Creator and his creation. I'm not sure if he means someone who worships, say, the sun as typical polytheism, or if he means something like pantheism.
It could be pantheism, or it could be the concept of individual God, that there's one master creator, but that there might still be individual gods, sub-gods for different areas, like a god of the sun, a god of the ocean. Maybe that's what he's referring to.
Interesting that, first of all, Kabbalah sort of kind of does that, and that there absolutely is belief in the frum world and in the traditional canon in metaphysical beings that control all this stuff. We just call them malachim instead of gods.
Yes. And again, it's such a strange concept that even in Bereshit, of course, the concept we have of God's creation is Na'aseh Adam B'Tzalmeinu Kidmusenu. It's all plural, and it makes no sense for a single God to be talking in the plural. And then the answer given is that it's angels. Why would God, if the ultimate is to know God's true unity, not temporary unity, but true unity, why would there be angels who are co-creators with God? Or co-designers,
right.
co-planners?
So there's two possible answers. One is that this was put in there deliberately by Hashem to teach us humility, that even he goes and consults with other beings. Or this is paraphrased from the Enuma Elish when El was creating Yuma. One of those.
Yeah, one of those, and one of them makes perfect sense, and the other makes none at all. But yes, we can go with the first one if they like.
The fourth group, acknowledgement of the unity of God with the mind and the tongue after one knows how to bring proofs on it, and to comprehend the truth of his unity through intellectual derivation and correct sound reasoning. This is the complete and important group. And this is the level at which the prophet exhorted us in saying, know therefore this day and sit in your heart that the Lord, he is God. So this is his goal. This is where he wants to bring us.
Yes, and it's going to be an interesting journey.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe by the time we're done, I'll be frum again.
I'll take a wager on that, and if I become frum, it pays double.
All right, so this will wrap it up. And thank you for joining us. I enjoyed this a lot. This was fun.
Yeah, this was fun. My pleasure.
That was my conversation with Michael, covering the first 3 chapters of the Chovos HaLevavos. Some notes on some of the things we discussed. We mentioned tefillin. I said how such amulets were common at that time and place. And Michael said that it seemed obvious to him that the psukim were metaphorically. The English word we use for tefillin, phylacteries, is derived from an ancient Greek word that means amulet. Such amulets, consisting of verses or passages inside some sort of container that was strapped to the body, were very popular during the time of the Second Beis HaMikdash. They're found among Christians and later among Muslims. It seems that tefillin themselves didn't appear until the Second Temple period. Historic sources, such as Philo of Alexandria, seem to assume that the psukim are meant metaphorically, and he doesn't mention any sort of physical object, tefillin as we know them. We discussed what the Chovos HaLevavos means by unity, and neither of us were quite sure what that meant. I said that it seemed to ring a bell, something to do with Greek philosophy, so I looked it up. What he's talking about is Neoplatonism, particularly the ideas of Plotinus. These Neoplatonic texts were available in Arabic translation at the time, and that Rabbeinu Bechaya, the author of the Chovos HaLevavos, lived, and they were popular. Plotinus posited that the basis of reality is the one, some unknowable substance, or that is the source of everything that exists. I think the Chovos HaLevavos identifies the one with Hashem, and that's what he's talking about by the unity. From the one emanates the rest of the universe. And this is his conception of God, that from God emanates the rest of the universe, and this is what we have to know and grasp. I think that's his goal. When we were discussing it, it was actually making me a little concerned, like in the back of my mind, that this is something that everyone must know about, and I'm just an ignoramus who doesn't know what the unity is, and how could I be doing a series like this on Hashkafa seforim if I don't even know something like this? And then when I looked into it, and I realized that this is Neoplatonism, I realized that it's the exact opposite. I at least had an idea where to look. It sounded vaguely familiar, and I could find out what he was talking about. The average student in yeshiva or Beis Yaakov, or the average Beis Medrash guy or seminary girl who's taught the Chovos HaLevavos or has a seder in the Chovos HaLevavos, they definitely have no idea what the unity is. And most, I was going to say all, but there's probably some yeshiva guy out there who's into philosophy, but most people, they would have no idea what the unity is. They would have even no starting point to find out what it is, and they have no context, the larger philosophical context of what the Chovos HaLevavos is talking about simply isn't there. They're learning about this in a vacuum. Is there any chance that they actually understand what they're learning? Which makes me feel much better about my qualifications for expounding on all. Finally, a correction. Michael brought up that the Torah says, "Let us make man," in the plural, and why was God consulting with Malachim? That doesn't make any sense. And I said, well, it's because it's paraphrasing the Numa Elish, where El creates man. I was mistaken. It was Marduk and Ea, not El, who create man in the Numa Elish. The language there is plural because there are two gods involved, and because before going ahead with the creation of man, Marduk calls the council of the gods together and tells them what he's going to do. So he's saying to them, we are going to make man. Bereshis borrows from the Numa Elish, which is the Babylonian creation myth, quite a bit. For instance, another thing that it borrows from the Numa Elish is a battle between the god and the sea monster. In the Numa Elish, Marduk battles Tiamat, and in Bereshis, God battles the Leviathan. Tiamat, which is the name of, she's both a sea monster and a goddess in the Numa Elish, is the same word as Tehom, which, at the beginning of Bereshis, God is floating above. Thanks so much to Michael for having been my guest this week, and thank you all for listening. This has been Hashkafa with a Heretic. Until next week, keep questioning, and remember that kashas aren't teruts and insults aren't answers, and while there are many good reasons to be frum, the obvious truth of orthodoxy isn't one of them.